Graphic warning. This is a disturbing story that happened to me about 4 years ago. It was around December. The snowstorms were starting to come in, and it was becoming very cold. Me and my wife were trying to get everything we could before winter started, mainly food and supplies. The problem is that we didn't have a car. We couldn't afford it. I worked a low-wage job and was making enough to barely pay rent on our shitty old apartment. My wife usually stayed home and took care of our 2-month-old baby, and I was doing the best I could to save enough money for a car. And finally, after months of saving, I had enough. One day I came home and told my wife the good news, and she was relieved. The next day we went to our local car dealership. There was only 2 cars on the lot, and they weren't the greatest, but the prices were very low, and as long as it got us from point A to point B, we would be happy. So we did what we needed to, paid for it, got the keys, and drove off. The car was from 1984 and was pretty run down, but it drove just fine. 6 months later, I was cleaning out the car when I noticed something odd under the back seat. It was something that I had never seen before. Despite having checked the car multiple times at this point, I looked closer, but I would need a flashlight in order to see it clearly. It looked like a black box of some kind. I thought it was just something the previous owner had left behind. Finally, curiosity got the best of me and I pulled it out of the car. It was an old VHS tape, marked Happy Memories. It looked to be around the same age as the car. I didn't know what to do with it. I just thought it was some old home video from the previous owner, although it was pretty strange that it was hiding underneath the seat. While I didn't want to invade anyone's privacy, I decided that I wanted to see what was on the tape to satisfy my curiosity. I went up to my attic and found my old VHS player. I hadn't used it since high school, back when I threw parties and me and my buddies would watch movies on it. It was a bit dusty, but it still worked just fine. I turned it on and put in the tape. It started off pretty normal. It was a family during Christmas, people walking around, opening gifts, etc. Then things got a little uncomfortable. The husband and wife began arguing while the children were crying in the background. The argument got more and more intense as it went on. I could not make out exactly what was being said. The camera cut off and the screen was black, before cutting back into a scene that was so fucked up that it kept me up for weeks after. I will never get this image out of my head. The camera was now set up in a dark room. There was torture weapons hanging from the walls and dismembered body parts scattered across the floor. The same wife and children from the beginning were now on their knees chained together and sobbing. That's about as much detail as I'm willing to go into. There was also a man in the room whose face was cut off from the camera's view. The man stepped out of frame and switched off the overhead light. And what he said next won't stop repeating in my head. I guess this is a happy memory for someone like me. After that, all that was heard was the horrified screams of the family. I had to turn off the tape. I couldn't take it anymore. I took the tape out and just stared at it for what seemed like hours. The images of the bodies, all the blood, the terrified faces of the family were now burnt into my mind. It was hours before I said a single word to anyone. I eventually called the police and explained what I had found. After weeks of investigation, they found out that this tape was of a family who had gone missing 32 years ago. They said that their house was demolished in 2003, and a car dealership was built in its place. The exact same place where I got the car. That's when it hit me. Thinking back, the car salesman looked a lot like the husband from the beginning of the video, except a lot older. Now that I think about it, he was kind of in a hurry to get us out of there after we bought the car, shortly after the shop was closed down, and is now abandoned. A lot of my friends went there over the years and said it was a really good place for a cheap car. I would pass it every day driving to work. I'm assuming the police followed up on all of this during their investigation, but I never heard of any arrests being made or further updates on the case. As far as I know, that man is still out there. I'm currently working as an intern at a historical society. That's not what the story is about. That's only important so you know that I kinda have a thing for preserving the past. I really love looking through other people's stuff, but mostly I'm a bit of a hoarder. I hoard a lot of stuff, but one of the things I love the most is old bootleg VHS tapes. You see, the thing is that there was a phase in American life where anybody could put anything on a VHS tape, and it would just sit there, secret and hidden, for months until someone else played it. VHS tapes are even vulnerable in a way, because water can erase them. It's almost like they are these sad, lost kids. Anyways, I got boxes and boxes of tapes in the basement. I wanted to share with you one of the spookier ones. So the cover, because covers are important, is a Scotch T120 with scratch marks all over it. It looks like it was tossed out of a car window and dragged along the asphalt. I found it at a Goodwill store. The label is the kind that came with the tape, and it just says, trees. Unfortunately, I'm unable to show you what's on the tape, but here's basically what happens. It starts off with static, then cuts to footage of a line of 50-foot Norwegian pines. They have branches that sort of hang down. They look heavy. The sky is near twilight. There's blips in the audio and around the edges of the video. There are 6 trees in the frame. Clouds slowly pass overhead. A man says, "See? Look at them." The video goes on for about another minute, slightly wobbling in the man's hands. Around the bottom of the trees, you can see a dirt road with churned up tracks, like a bulldozer has recently been through. "Look! Yeah, I saw you. You can't hide. Danny says I'm crazy, and..." The man trails off, then keeps going on in a sing-along voice. "I'm going to find you, I'm going to show him. You keep changing, every time I drive by, I see you at me. He doesn't believe me, there in the branches. Danny, I'm gonna show you this." A hand appears on the left of the frame and tries to outline a certain tree. It's a stubby hand, normal looking. The first time I saw it, I imagined the camera guy was wearing a Chicago Bears windbreaker. "Danny, look here. Look. Look at the branches." Then the tape cuts. It's early morning, at the same stand of trees. "See? See? Don't you see?" A construction worker then walks into frame.
"Hey you! Hey buddy, what are you doing here? Get the fuck out of..."
The tape cuts to static. When it cuts back, it's inside of a shitty apartment. Sparse furnishings, a dirty black futon, white dirty walls, ashtrays, empty beer cans standing on a glass coffee table. The camera focuses on the ashtray, and you can hear the man talking off camera. It literally is 30 minutes of whispering. I've tried to decipher it, but I can't. He says trees and bushes a whole bunch of times, but I can't pick out much more. At the end, the camera suddenly whips to the right, into the kitchen, and the man gasps. Despite his whole diatribe, it seems he wasn't really expecting anything to happen to him, and even though there's no sound on the tape, before it whips around, he acts like he's just been snuck up on, like some kind of loud noise has happened that only he can hear. "Who's there? Danny? Is that you?" Cut to the trees again, this time closer and from the opposite side. It seems the cameraman is hiding behind a stand of overgrown bushes. "Okay, so I got a different angle now. Danny, look. Look hard. Look hard at the places where the branches meet the trees. In the shadows there, you can see them moving. It's kind of tough because of the light, but Danny, trust me, you're the only one who gives a shit anymore." This is kind of awkward because the man gets choked up. "Danny, please tell me you see them. Sometimes they climb down. Sometimes they..." You can hear another construction worker come up. There's a scuffle and the camera gets taken away and turned off. The thing is though, and I only caught this because I watched it twice. There's a few frames where you can actually see something. Just before the construction guy interrupts, while the man is turning the camera down and onto the ground, there are several frames where you can see a dark figure beneath the trees. I slowed this down and gone by frame. There's a person there, just squatting. It's a black outline without features. It doesn't move. It seems to be holding its hands together, resting its elbows on its bowed knees. It doesn't seem to have hair or clothes. I have no idea what the fuck it is. I would show you a still shot, but after messing around with the tape, it snapped inside the VCR. I tried examining it under the light, but all the frames that had the mysterious figure are permanently damaged. Sometimes I have to close my blinds and curtains to make sure the movement of the trees outside my windows doesn't make it in. I just get nervous that I might see arms or legs, or that human figure climbing among the branches. A couple years ago, I found this old VHS tape at my grandparents' house. I know this is kind of cliche, but it was a nondescript tape with no markings on it. It wasn't on the shelf with the other tapes and the few DVDs that my grandparents owned. It was buried in the backyard, inside a metal box. You may be wondering why I found a buried tape in the backyard. That's a fair question. I got a little carried away with my younger brother's metal detector one afternoon. I swear he's such a dork. He bought it online and he was taking the damn thing down the beach almost every other day. When my grandfather passed away, he decided to give it a whirl in their backyard. Moreover, according to my dad, they would bury all sorts of things back there as kids. What I didn't expect to find, though, was a metal box containing a VHS tape. It was buried behind the shed, several feet down. I was surprised that the metal detector was able to pick up on something that was buried that deep. I was all alone when I found it, so I didn't exactly go and tell it on the mountain, if you know what I mean. Initially, I thought it must have been some kind of fun, cutesy thing my grandparents did. I wouldn't put it past them to bury something in the backyard, then forget all about it. Maybe it was their wedding tape or something. But then I had this sinking feeling. A premonition, really. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be found, especially by me. I waited until I knew I could have a little time alone. I took one of the old VCRs from my grandparents' house and attached it to a TV in the garage, and then I proceeded to play the tape. It was fuzzy and grainy because, you know, it was a really old tape. But then I started to get a little creeped out. For the first 2 minutes or so, the camera was just focusing on an old chair in some dimly lit room. I kept straining my eyes, trying to tell what was happening. The video seemed to freeze and then come back into motion. All the while, the chair was there on the foreground, resting against the wall. Then a hooded figure walked into the room. In his right hand was a knife. In his other, he held a young girl by the wrists. She looked like she was a teenager. She was blindfolded and her arms were tied behind her back. A piece of tape was over her mouth. The hooded figure then put her in a chair and then walked out of frame. He kept walking up to her and patting her on the head, and then he would walk out of frame again. I turned up the volume, but all I could hear was muffled sounds, like the camcorder that was used had a nearly broken microphone. Everything was garbled and incoherent. I started feeling sick, like I was watching something disgusting. Every part of my inside started to churn. I could feel the vomit rising inside me. I didn't want to watch another second of the tape, but I just had to know what it was. For the next few minutes, it was just footage of the girl sitting in the chair, her hands bound behind her back. She appeared to be talking or crying. I couldn't be sure because of the quality, and I could barely make out anything as I watched. It was super unsettling. It was just this girl tied to a chair, and some person in a cloak with a knife who was nowhere to be seen. I started to feel like I was watching an actual horror movie. I wanted the girl to get up and run out of the room. I wanted someone to storm in and set her free, but I had this sinking feeling that this was not how the movie ended. Unfortunately, I was right. The hooded figure returned. He walked over to the girl and lifted her chin with his free hand. The look in her eyes cracked my soul in two. Then the figure pulled his cloak back. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was my grandfather. I turned the tape off and ejected it. I held it in my hands, wondering what I should do with it. Destroy it? Turn it into the authorities? I don't know why, but I put the tape back in the metal box and walked around the corner of the tool shed and placed it where I had dug it up. I threw it back into the earth and began piling dirt on it again. All I could think of was trying to bury what I had found, hiding the evidence that was now making me sick. That's when I heard my grandmother's voice behind me. "What are you doing?" she asked. I looked up at her smiling face, those innocent eyes. She was the sweetest person I knew. I couldn't dare risk her knowing what I had unearthed. The thought of her knowing what was on that tape, knowing that her husband of 50+ years had this dark, horrible obsession, just killed me. So I lied the best I could. "Oh, nothing, Grandma. I just thought I found something buried back here, but I was wrong." Her face turned from the normal relaxed smile she usually wore to a cold stare. My heart sank. Grandma took a couple of steps closer to me, her eyes staring deep into mine. Her expression was solemn and serious. "That tape was buried for a reason. You weren't supposed to ever see it." She sighed emphatically. "But now that you know, I might as well show you everything else. Follow me." My stomach was hot and heavy as I followed my grandmother back inside. She walked slowly, like someone who was trying to stall. We walked in silence past her pristine clean kitchen and into the hallway. I couldn't help but look at the family photos that lined both hallways. Right in the middle was our massive family portrait, next to this ironic picture of my grandparents at their wedding. I always loved looking at this picture growing up. They both looked so young and so happy, like there was nothing in the world that could defeat their love. Part of me wondered now if that was part of the problem. Grandma kept walking past the bedrooms, to the back of the house where the basement was. Of course she's taking me to the basement, I thought. This was all too real, too stereotypical, too unnerving. She unlocked the basement door and took a deep breath. We stood there in silence for a moment before she spoke. "I'm not proud of this, but sometimes you have to deal with the, complications of the person you love. Grandma, please, you don't have to show me anything. Honest. No, you need to know. It's time that you knew the truth." She smiled faintly at me, her eyes moist with tears. We started down the steps. One by one we walked, down the rickety staircase my grandpa always swore was dangerous, which is why we never went into the basement. But also he kept the damn thing padlocked all the time. My dad would always say it was for safety reasons. We believed him. Why the hell wouldn't we? We stood on the cold cement floor. A bitter draft blew through. I shivered as I waited for Grandma to turn on the lights. When she did, I was surprised. The basement was ordinary in every way imaginable. It was mainly dusty boxes piled in the corners, and a few old knickknacks and relics placed here and there. I heard Grandma take another deep breath. My chest ached at the sound. "Your grandfather had a problem. It began when he was a young boy, and the war didn't help much either." I don't know why, but I just blurted out, "Was he a murderer?" My grandma turned. Tears dripped down her cheeks. She forced a smile as she wiped them away. "He had a lot of issues. That tape you saw was part of it. He kept that part of him hidden for years, all the while your dad and aunt were growing up. He was the perfect father. I didn't know about any of this, but one day I came down here to look for some Christmas decorations my sister, your great aunt Sally, said that she had loaned me. I never found it, but I did find a small door built into the wall." My grandma showed me in a small alcove was a tiny door built into the wall. It looked like a whimsical feature, something that you would find in Alice in Wonderland. It was the exact same color as the stone wall, except it had a dark brass doorknob and a lock. I never knew it existed, so naturally, I never tried to open it. I thought maybe it was your grandpa's secret treasure trove room. Boys love to collect and conceal their prizes, so I figured that's what it was. I was able to jimmy the lock open, but what I found..." She paused, catching her breath, wiping her eyes again. "Well, you know what I found, don't you? I found a tape. But not just one. There were several of them." My grandma opened the tiny door to the wall and showed me what was inside. It was like a miniature Blockbuster in there. Shelves lined the walls, enough space to house hundreds of tapes. But it was empty. Completely empty. "Here's where I found them, all lined up along the wall. He had magazines too. Dirty magazines. I couldn't talk to him for weeks, but then I finally confessed what I had found, and we talked through it." None of this made any sense to me. Why the hell would you go on living like everything was completely fine if you had a psychopath living in the room with you, compiling his awful sex tapes? I didn't understand. At first, he promised to stop. He told me that he made his last tape and that it would never happen again. He told me all the girls on the tapes were misfits and troublemakers. They were lost girls that didn't have homes or morals. He was doing the world a favor, he said, ridding the world of unwanted women who would become pregnant and end up on welfare. And the sad thing is, I believed him. And I guess I agreed too. I stood there trying to find the words, but I was empty. Any notion of my grandparents' character disintegrated in that moment. I was enraged. I felt sick, angry, and betrayed, like my whole life and the legacy handed to me was a lie. Did my parents know? Did they care? Or were they as nonchalant about it as my grandma? I wanted to scream. I wanted to curse her out because this was twisted, sick shit. How could he? And how could you allow it? My grandma cupped my face in her hands, like she used to do when I was younger. She looked into my eyes. "You're a good soul. Some aren't so lucky, sweetie. Your grandpa had his demons." This was all too much. I started to pace back and forth. I didn't know what to say or what to think. None of it made any sense. "But why didn't you turn him in? Why did you let him have this sick obsession?" "I tried to fight him on it at first, but something changed in me, I guess." I looked at her, still confused, still in shock. "What are you saying? Where are the rest of the tapes?" My grandma smiled slightly at me, her dark brown eyes dry from tears. They locked into mine. I stared into them, and they were empty and void. After I couldn't get your grandpa to stop, I accepted my fate. All I could do was help him. "What? You helped him?" I would hold the camera. My heart was beating hard and fast. It was too much. Way too much. "Where are the tapes?" "After your grandfather passed, I buried them, one by one in the backyard. I couldn't bear the thought of destroying our work, but I knew that no one could ever see them." She paused and looked at me. "Unless, of course, you want to watch them." My grandma moved around the corner of the alcove, past the small door where the tapes had been concealed. She held up a suit bag and placed the bag on a hook on the wall. She unzipped the bag and held out its contents. It was a black robe with a hood. She smiled sadistically at me as she held it in her hands. "He would want you to have this," she said.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
This took place mid-July of 2020. I live in the city, but I often drive to my hometown, if you can even call it that. It's a grain elevator in the middle of a cornfield, just to get away from the hustle and bustle and enjoy some peace and quiet. I prefer to go on my hikes alone, sometimes with or without my dog, depending on what animals I'm trying to observe. This time I chose to go alone, so I parked my car at the river just a few miles from the woods that I wanted to walk through. There's something about being able to see everything illuminated by the moonlight and hearing the coyotes that makes me feel at peace. I'd finally made it halfway down the dirt road that leads to the woods. I stopped for a moment because I felt a whoosh of really cold air. I thought that was so strange because it was a muggy Indiana night, around 80 degrees. I stayed there for a moment looking around to see if there was a logical explanation for the draft that I could see with my eyes, but nada. At that point, I looked directly above me and saw 3 baby raccoons trying to sleep on a branch just above my head. I remember thinking to myself, that's kind of odd, aren't raccoons nocturnal? But I just appreciated them for a moment and kept on going. I get another 500 feet down the road and whoosh, another burst of cold air. I stop again to try and figure out how that was happening. There were clear skies, 0 wind. I couldn't think of a good explanation. Before I had much more time to think on it, I heard something. To the right of me was a mostly unkempt hay and grass field, probably about knee-high at most. The moon was so bright that it was impossible to not get a good view of everything. I hear this rustling in the grass, maybe 20 feet away from me, and then it just stopped. I could see the animal now. I'll do my best to describe it. It was on all fours, but it appeared that it had the ability to be bipedal if it chose to be. I could see the nape of its neck, down to where the animal's back legs would be. The hair on its back was very strange. It had a large, thick mohawk ridge along its spine. From what I could see of the animal, I assumed that it had to weigh close to 100 pounds. Its steps were very heavy. Nothing graceful at all about it. The rest of the hair on the animal's body looked similar to that of a chimpanzee or some sort of ape. The 2 front legs were very powerful, had a broadly set stance. But the thing that messed with me the most was the sound. I'll never forget it. I was holding my breath, hoping I had just run across one of the many feral swamp dogs and that he would run off since they don't like people. I realized quickly that I was wrong. As I stood there staring, this animal started sort of loping, pacing into a figure-8 pattern. It did this for maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And then, the thing charged me. That's when it made the sound. There was something so wrong with its breathing. Forgive me if I'm being offensive, that's not my intent. But this animal sounded like someone who was trying to breathe but didn't have a nose, or some serious damage to its airways. It was like a snarl, growl, breath, all in one. I could hear it snap its jaws when it backed away from the bluff. This all happened so fast. Let me try to give more context. About another 500 feet away from where this happened, there's an old-fashioned settler's cabin. My first thought was to get there for safety, but before I could even make that choice, I heard a scream. Not a human scream. I'm not an expert, but through my many years of living in the woods and observing the different animals, I've got an okay ear for knowing what animal calls come from what animal. This scream sounded like a mountain lion. We don't even have those here. So basically I had to say no to that plan for safety. But wait, there's more. If you continue down the dirt road past the abandoned cabin, there's a small parking lot. The reason I didn't take my car there is because you're not supposed to be in that park at night. Well, someone else was there too. After I heard that scream, I heard a car and then started to see the headlights come over the hill toward me by the cabin. At this point, I was flipping out. The crazy animal that charged me was nowhere to be seen. There might be a crazed wildcat just a few feet away, and now some Cutlass Supreme is hauling ass in my direction. In all my wisdom and fantastic decision-making, I dove into the hayfield to hide from the car. Yes, the same field that the crazy animal was in. Thankfully, they didn't see me, but they were absolutely flying, tearing out of that place like a bat out of hell. It made me wonder if they had something to do with the screaming animal or the weird one in the field. Needless to say, I had had enough of that night and cut my way through other properties and woods to get back to the river where my car was. This happened around 2006 or 7. There is this guy, I'll call him Dean here, who's widely known in my small village. Dean was a drug addict, but managed somehow to work and build a family. But his addiction got worse, and eventually I got the news that he died in a mixed drugs overdose. We, friends and my then boyfriend, talked on a few different occasions about his death, how it was somehow foreseeable that he would die, and so on. Not long after he passed, like 2 months, I had just opened our pub at 4 p.m. and Dean walks in. He didn't look great, but he also didn't look dead. He noticed my facial expression and got slightly pissed as to why I was looking at him in such a way, so I quickly shook it off and served him. Later that evening when my boyfriend arrived, I asked him what was going on with Dean, that he should be 6 feet under, but he said that he had no knowledge about Dean being dead, or that we had had talks about it. I asked them if maybe I confused him with someone else's death who we all knew and we were talking about, but they denied having knowledge of someone else's death. The funny part is that after this happened, Dean got rid of his addiction and got his shit together. A glitch which happened earlier, around 2004, where my same as above boyfriend and best friend and I went to Berlin for 3 days. We rented a room for 3 in a little lo-fi hotel. So the first evening, it was Friday, we went out and looked for a location to have a good time. Locals guided us to a known party street where usually a lot of people were out, but for some unknown reason, nothing was going on that night at all. Only a few people were there. We still decided to bar hop and have a good time, just us 3. We drank a lot of tequila and water, and after we got kicked out of a bar, only for the reason that the owner disliked our nationality, we left this street and walked up to a kebab where we ate and drank even more, and then decided to head towards our hotel. We did, and the next thing I clearly remember was that we entered a really tiny, cozy bar which was plastered in red velvet and had all dimmed down lights. I think even the carpeting was velvet. We had funny talks with the older locals, men and women, inside, and they were thrilled about our language when we talked to each other. At one point, I felt too drunk and said to my companions that I wanted to go to bed. They felt the same, and we left. I then literally stormed away along this street, thinking our hotel was about 1 kilometer or so away, and I wanted to hurry. But after I went like this for about 20 meters, my companions yelled after me so that I would come back, because our hotel seemed to be right next door to that bar. Really, really next. Like next in the way of the bar door and the hotel door were about 20 centimeters away from each other. We didn't notice the bar when we arrived, and when we left the hotel earlier that day. Well confused, we went in and slept. The next day at noon, when we went out, there was no bar at all next to our hotel. Not even its door. And it didn't show up the following night either. We are still talking about this, and at least this time my friend and former boyfriend seem to remember the same things. This is my sister's story. It happened when she must have been about 16. She's 22 this year. We live in Queensland, Australia, and this happened at my grandmother's house. Her land is quite big. There's about 7 acres for the area, considering that this happened right in the middle of a very well-populated suburb. Her house is right next to the school that my sister went to, like jump the fence next to. There are 3 houses on my grandma's street. I put street in quotations because it's basically just one giant driveway that my grandma lives at the end of. The neighbor's backyard is visible through some light trees at my grandma's front yard. The reason I explain this is because from reading a lot of Skinwalker stories, this doesn't seem like the typical setting. It must have been about 8 p.m. during winter in Australia, so it was pretty dark. She was dog-sitting my grandma's 2 very little dogs, Ruby and Crystal, for the weekend. She let them out to go to the toilet and kept an eye on them because they get distracted pretty easily. She called the dogs and only Crystal came running to the door. There's a dim light that illuminates the porch, but not her yard. She could barely see Ruby, but she was just sitting there, staring at her. She called her name a few more times in a high-pitched voice, which the dogs always come running to. Ruby took a few steps forward and just sat down again, still staring at my sister. My sister always emphasizes that Ruby looked all types of wrong. Her face appeared as if someone had tried to draw Ruby from memory, but just couldn't. She explains that it looked like a human crawling, but as if they were a dog. My sister was super freaked out. She noticed that she couldn't see or hear Ruby anywhere. She closed the door and ran into the room where both of the dogs had been sitting and where she was watching TV. And there they were, sitting on their bed, acting completely normal. She ran back to the door, and the thing pretending to be Ruby was gone. She locked the door and went straight to bed. It wasn't until recently that she brought up this story again. She had told it many times before, but considering I was about 8 the first time that she had told this story, I wasn't paying much attention to it. I recognized it as a skinwalker since I loved the episode of the Jenna and Julian podcast where they talk about them. I went to my sister and told her that that was what it was. My sister and I, being the paranormal addicts that we are, spent hours telling our sister and dad about skinwalkers. To this day, I'm still terrified that we have skinwalkers in Australia. This happened about 15 years ago. I woke up that day feeling really odd, and my very good friend back then called me and said that she woke up also feeling weird, so I told her to come over. We couldn't shake this strange feeling off. Something just felt weird, but we couldn't put a finger on it. We decided to go out in the evening, and when we were walking through Piccadilly Circus in London, something crazy happened. The closest thing that I could compare it to would be that we ended up in this see-through bubble, and everything around us paused for about 3 seconds, and we were, me and her, in sort of slow motion while we were in that bubble. And then snap, and everything went back to normal, but we stood there looking at each other completely and utterly freaked out, as we both experienced the same thing. We just stood there in shock, thinking, what the fuck just happened? We were so shaken by this that we had one drink in the bar and decided to go home. She went to mine as she didn't want to be alone, so we took the train back, and while we were walking to my house, we heard a gunshot, and that bullet passed me by an inch and went into a car that was parked next to us on the side of the road. I literally felt it touch my hair while flying past me. There was a guy in the car who got out and started screaming and panicking as the bullet hit the side door, and we stood there petrified, thinking, what the fuck is happening today? We then ran off and sprinted all the way to my house. The area I used to live in back then is one of the safest areas in London. It was by St. Catherine's Docks by Tower Hill, so whoever is from London can relate. Also, gun crime in the UK is very rare, pretty much below zero, so this whole incident just didn't make any sense. I don't know whether it was related to the slow motion thing earlier and the world pausing, but I couldn't help but think to myself that if I had walked there a second earlier, I would have gotten hit. I was riding my bike down a long road with almost zero vehicles on it. I was in the dedicated bike lane, scooting along as I'd done hundreds of times before down this stretch of road. There's about 3 feet of opening gap between the curb of this road and the bike lane, followed by a 3-foot wide bike lane, and then finally the vehicle lane. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or bike lane unless they're the city maintenance vehicle crews. Vehicles are not allowed to park in the gap or the bike lane unless they're the city maintenance crews that service the road, grass, and noise walls of this particular stretch. Well, this day there was a big blue moving truck parked right on the curb, wide enough to take up the empty 3-foot gap and the 3-foot wide bike lane and spill over into the vehicle lane. I thought, no big deal, as there weren't any cars behind me and I had plenty of space to move into the road to go around it. The spot where the truck was stopped was the only spot on the stretch of road where the shrubbery from the other side of the noise wall was growing into the ground and out the other side. It sticks out like a sore thumb. But anyway, as I was going around the truck and into the vehicle lane, the door to the cab of the truck flew open forcefully right as I was about to pass it. I'm talking like the person that threw it open was trying their best to hurt me and waited for the best opportunity. At the last second, I clenched my teeth, swerved out of the way, and just instinctively swerved back into the bike lane and came to a stop. Angry and full of adrenaline, I screamed at them what was their problem, that they could have killed me, while dismounting my bike and making my way to the truck. This is where it got strange. There was no one inside the truck itself. I went back toward it, and there was no one outside of the truck either. It was really just there, with the door still wide open. There was nowhere anyone could have slipped away to. The noise walls are there to spare the neighboring homes from car noises, and they're about 10 feet tall, and they stretch out for a good quarter mile, with no open gaps anywhere. I went around to the back of the truck, and it was open and empty. Nothing in it, no hiding spots. Just an empty truck and an empty cab. I decided to just jump on my bike and go home. I pushed it out of my head and considered myself lucky to be unharmed. That lasted about a day. I can't help but feel like I was in some moment in time that somehow got stuck. Upon remembering the occurrence, there was almost no sound. No other cars driving by, no birds chirping, no wind blowing on what was actually a fairly windy day. It wasn't until I got closer to my home that everything felt normal again, and I was able to move past it. Now it plagues me that I didn't take a photo with my phone or didn't look for one of those "How's my driving" stickers to report the truck. It's one of those glitches that I'm just gonna have to wonder about forever. It was late summer, and my mom and I had decided that we should go out for a little spontaneous hike. We did our research, and found one trail that said it was a 4-mile round trip. Sounded easy enough. We got up early that morning, and began our trek. The entire forest had a horrible vibe. Even my mom picked up on it, and she's never been into any of the paranormal, etc. We had been walking around for hours, and this forest just seemed to get weirder and weirder. We had plenty of water and food, so I really can't say if we were just dehydrated or tired. We began to hear singing in the woods, and we just stopped and stared at each other. We had to be miles into the forest by now. Our step counter was saying that we had well surpassed the promised 4 miles. Where on earth Would singing be coming from out there? We just looked at each other and began laughing. I remember her saying, "No way," and shaking her head and carrying on. It had been quite some time now, and we hadn't encountered another person on the trail. Suddenly, this man walking really fast surpasses us and rounds a bend behind a rocky hill so that we can't see him anymore. He said no words, just came up behind us and darted by. Again, me and my mom laughed and envied his athleticism until we rounded the bend ourselves to find that he was completely gone, out of sight. The path after that bend was fairly straight, and you can see far ahead of you, so there's absolutely no way he would have been able to clear that area that fast. This time my mom stops and says, "You gotta be kidding me." We're thoroughly freaked out after this. Eventually, we reach the peak, and after walking that long, you'd think that someone would probably want to stay there for a while and enjoy the view. Well, we pretty much got to the top, looked, and then left. We never discussed it, but I could tell that we were both uncomfortable and just wanted to leave. We were maybe halfway back through the trail, and the sun was beginning to set. We were moving fast. Our step counter said that we had hiked 10 miles compared to the 4 that we had initially expected. As the forest got darker, I began to hear leaves crunching behind us. I reluctantly turned and noticed that it was a buck several yards away. We hurried along as to not disturb it further, but then I began noticing that something was off. It was following us from a distance. It did so almost like a predator, hiding and peeking. I tell my mom that we were being followed by the deer, and we were pretty much at a jog at that point. The buck would not let us go. I would sometimes notice that it would catch up and follow just beside us. It always remained several yards away, though, always lurking, head down. I've lived out in the country my entire life, and have seen all the deer that you can imagine. I've never been followed by one like this. This seemed more than just curiosity. It felt horrible, predatory. I felt like I was in danger, always hearing those footsteps behind me, the feeling of being watched. Clearly, we made it out unharmed, but I really wonder if it actually intended to hurt us, or if it was just ushering us out of the forest. All in all, it was a freaky experience. Something is definitely up with those woods. So be patient with me. This is super hard to explain, but I'll do my best as I really think something weird happened to us in this haunted city. Back when we could go outside without fear, my friends and I went to Savannah, Georgia for my bachelorette weekend. For anyone who isn't familiar with downtown Savannah, there's a large intersection in front of these extremely old historical steps that lead to the Riverwalk where the river is and a bunch of stores. While waiting at the intersection for our turn to walk across the street so we could get to the historic steps, all of a sudden everything went really quiet, and time literally seemed to stand still. We turned to look at each other, all noticing the weird feeling of stillness, and slowly started to walk across the intersection, nervously giggling to ourselves as we pointed out that even though the lights still hadn't turned for us to walk, all the cars that would usually be still driving by were stopped dead in the middle of the road, way before you would normally stop at an intersection, with one car literally in the process of turning, yet idling completely still in the middle of that intersection, stopping for no reason whatsoever, with the driver appearing to be frozen. At this point, we were noticing we didn't hear any birds anymore, or sounds at all for that matter, except for the crosswalk timer saying to wait over and over, as if someone was hitting the button repeatedly, yet we were the only ones around. Completely freaked the F out, we hurriedly crossed the street, all expressing, kinda loudly as we were freaking out, about why everything and everyone seemed frozen in time. Once we made it to the other side of the road, just as quickly as the stillness began, the wind started to blow and the birds started to fly, car started moving again, and people that were definitely not around us before were suddenly there. We all looked at each other and around us, and I swear people probably thought we were all on drugs. I felt like Harry, Ron, and Hermione when they jumped to the regular world in the last Harry Potter, all of a sudden there, when they weren't before. And to this day, we all have absolutely no idea what happened. We felt like we went through some sort of time glitch or something, or a portal of some sort, if that's the right word, but we definitely experienced something in the middle of that road. We later asked our Uber that night if it had happened to them before, to which he replied that we needed to give him whatever drugs we were on. If this has happened to anyone else, please let me know. Also, I might add that we were completely sober, as it was mid-morning and we were on the way to breakfast on the Riverwalk, and definitely not on any drugs. I'm from Norway, and I'm fortunate to travel a lot. During my travels, I've seen the same dad and son on 3 different occasions, 3 different continents, in 3 different decades. And they looked exactly the same each time. So the first time I saw them was in New York, back in 1999. I took an escalator in a mall near Times Square. I was going down, they were going up. All 3 of us stared at each other until I reached the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward to 2009. I'm in Rome with my family, and in a new mall, new escalator. I see them again. They look exactly the same, and I realized that I had seen them before. And we do the same thing. Stare until I reach the bottom, and they, the top. Fast forward again, this time to Dubai in 2019. I'm at the Dubai Mall, and you guessed it. There they are. This time it looked like they recognized me too. They just stared at me different, like they didn't want me to see them. They both looked very serious and almost angry. This time I felt super uncomfortable because I immediately recognized them. And this is 20 years after I saw them the first time, which raises a few questions. First of all, why do I keep seeing them in the exact same situation? Why don't they age? Is it just a coincidence? Why always on the escalator? And why do they stare at me until I'm out of sight? The weird thing is that in the malls I've seen them in, you usually walk around for a few hours, but I've never seen them anywhere else besides the escalator. Also, the son looks to be around 14 or 15. That's why it's so easy to see that they hadn't aged a bit. Kid was still 14 or 15, 20 years later. This last Halloween, I didn't have many friends. Only 2 at the time who wanted to celebrate together. One eventually bailed, leaving me and my friend Rob to hang out alone. It was freezing, and I had to bike out to our usual rendezvous place, which was about equidistance from our houses. This place was a gas station adjacent to a very large field that was occasionally used for soccer games. Once we both arrived to the gas station, we went inside, got water and sunflower seeds, and left. Due to the pandemic, we decided not to risk exposure by trick-or-treating, so we went to go walk in this field. It was around 9:30 at night, and pitch black outside. We don't live near any major cities, so our only light was from the moon and the stars. The sky was clear that night, so around 5 minutes in, we became entranced by the stars in the sky, walking forward with our heads craned back, looking up. This went on for a minute or 2 before we thought we heard shuffling near us. We turned to the right to see a dark figure lit very dimly by the extraterrestrial light. I'm a rather small person, and Rob isn't too much bigger, so the littlest things normally will put us on edge. But this thing was different. It looked bipedal, though it seemed to be bent over with a near hunched back, and there were protrusions from its head, either horns or ears. It was difficult to tell. I immediately emitted a short scream and ran to the side toward Rob. I knew he occasionally carried a hunting knife, as he's more of an outback type of person than me. The thing then bent down to walk on all fours and started yipping strangely, like a small dog almost. My friend grabbed the back of my jacket and yanked me back and yelled at me to run. He then pulled out the hunting knife. The creature was pacing while still making strange noises. It looked like it was about to get closer before Rob threw the knife at the thing and got up to run. He yelled an exasperated "shit" as he started to sprint away. As we ran, I heard a voice repeatedly echo Rob's, also saying "shit." We ran all the way back to the gas station and to where we parked our bikes. Wordlessly, we decided it was best to just go inside the brightly lit station and just wait for our nerves to calm down. We haven't been able to hang out since due to the virus, but I doubt that we will go walking in that field at night again. Some weird shit happened to me about a year ago, and I haven't shared it with anyone because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy or not believe me. Anyway, at a family gathering at my grandma's house, my mom and I decided to go get some KFC for the family around noonish or so. Once we pulled up to the drive-thru, we waited for a little bit, and nobody was talking to us through the speaker thing. So after waiting, we decided to just pull up to the window. We noticed no one was there, so we thought, okay, fuck it, let's go inside. As we walk up, we see the whole restaurant looks closed, and the doors were locked. Lights are all off, and it's empty. No customers, no employees. There was even a row of high chairs that were put up on the counter, like when a restaurant is closed. We basically said fuck it again, and decided to go get pizza. About 20 to 30 minutes on our drive home from getting the pizza, we passed the same KFC, and my mom sees that it has cars in the drive-thru. My grandma was expecting chicken, so we stopped to get some chicken. Here's where it gets really fucking weird. We walk inside in order, then ask the lady why they opened so late. She gave us a confused look and said they've been open since 10 a.m. As I looked around, there were families who looked like they've been sitting there for a while, eating and chilling. I was so weirded out, I actually asked a family how long they were there for. They were nice people and told me for about an hour. My mom and I have never said anything to anyone, because we still don't know what the fuck happened. I even thought maybe the employees were late, so the cashier tried pulling one on me, but the family made me reconsider that. I don't know. Weird AF. And wondering if anything similar has ever happened to anyone. I don't usually really believe in most myths and legends and stuff like that, but something I recently witnessed made me doubt myself. I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but I might have had a very close encounter with something that is definitely not human and scared me out of my mind. Basically, last night I decided to go hang out with a close friend and skateboard around a bit, and I met some other friends from school down by a grocery store there. We decided to hang out for a while and walk around, and they told my friend and I that they needed to start walking home, and that they wanted to show us some apparently cool, sketchy treehouse, where people always go to chill and do drugs and whatnot on the way. We start walking that way, mostly through just suburban neighborhoods, and at that point, it's almost completely dark outside. There were around 7 of us at first, and people mostly started heading out until it was just said friend and I and a girl who had agreed to take us to see the treehouse since it was fairly close to her home. We take this pretty open path to a chain link fence with a hole in it. We go through using our phones as flashlights, and not far after there's another chain link fence with a hole in it, with the treehouse right behind, surrounded by loose bushes and a small forest. We're pretty scared at that point since it's dark, so the friend and the girl stay behind the fence while I go through the hole just outside. After looking at the treehouse for a few seconds, we start hearing rustling in the bushes. But although scared, dismiss it as a small animal, or maybe even one of our friends just messing with us since it's pretty close to several houses. Like an idiot, I keep standing outside the small hole in the fence, not moving while the rustling keeps moving around. We called out several times with no response, and the thing, whatever it was, kept shuffling and scuffing around in the bushes a little bit, rustling every few seconds. I tried looking, and could barely see it, but guessed that it was around half my height. It kept on, and after a bit we realized from the footstep patterns that it has begun to walk on 2 legs. This just about does it for us, and we get out of there, looking behind us every couple of seconds. On our way back, said friend told me earlier by the treehouse that he had caught a glimpse of something moving that was a whitish-gray color, a bit bigger than a large dog. I visited this treehouse again today with a couple more friends, and actually went up this time. But gladly, we didn't see or hear anything. And yes, I know that I would be the idiot to die in a horror movie. I haven't posted this here before, but I have commented about this incident in other posts. But having recently found this subreddit, I think it definitely fits in here. It was a couple of years ago. I was visiting my parents who still live in the same house that I grew up in. The day I came home, Mum told me that my old school bus driver had passed away the day before. I'd been very fond of him and would often bump into him before I had moved out of that town, as he lived in the same neighborhood as ours. So when Mum told me about his passing away, it was a heart attack, she said. I was quite upset, and I distinctly remember every detail about the conversation that I had with my mum about this. Later that evening, when I was out on a run, I noticed a little blue flyer by the park with his photograph and details of the funeral and a prayer meeting. A couple of days later, I was out buying groceries from the market when I saw him standing outside a shop, looking very much alive. I was confused AF and wondered if he had a twin brother. Either way, I didn't stop to chat. Later at home, when I told my mom what happened, she looked really confused and said that she never told me that he had died. I was naturally annoyed and tried to help her recall the conversation and told her about the flyer at the park. She asked me if I was okay, because she was sure as hell that she did not say any such thing about his death. So I go out to walk by the park to see if the flyer is still there, and it wasn't. I was extremely confused by this point, but having no logical explanation to offer, I decided to dismiss it. Not for long, though. A few days later, my holiday had come to an end, and I had returned back to the city where I work. Exactly a day later, I get a call from my mom saying that my bus driver had passed away that morning, and that it had been a heart attack. I couldn't believe it, and I figured that my mom was a bit freaked out too, 'cause she sounded a bit shaky. Not knowing what else to say, I asked her to check if a blue flyer with details of his funeral and prayer meetings was up at the park, whenever she could step out for a walk. Later that evening, she confirmed that there was a blue flyer with those details and his picture. Mom dismissed it as a coincidence and has never spoken of this incident again. Whenever I have tried to remind her, she says she doesn't recall all the details. But I know it's not true, and that she does remember this. It's just so freaky, and I get the chills every time I think about it. I just haven't been able to explain what happened. This began in January of this year. I live on the Front Range of Colorado, meaning that once the mountains stop, it's basically plains for miles and miles. There are a lot of small roads and strange dead ends around these parts, and one of these is a favorite of me and my friends as it goes a long way out from the main road with basically no reason for anyone else to be there. This privacy is great for any variety of teenage shenanigans. Back in January, I was high as hell in the back of my friend's car as we drove down that road, hoping to park at the end so that we could smoke some more. As I was staring out the window, I swore that I could see the silhouette of a tall, strangely proportioned person running alongside our car. It was far out in the field, and I convinced myself that it was just my inebriated mind playing tricks on me so that I wouldn't freak out. And I didn't tell my friends so that it wouldn't bother them. We parked there for a few hours, lights off, and then went home with nothing else amiss. This actually makes me want to die now. Tonight I was headed back out to that spot with my girlfriend, both of us in separate cars. My drive up was pretty uneventful, but there was some fog that made it pretty spooky. Once we parked, my girlfriend hopped into my car and was obviously super freaked out. Once I got her to calm down, she told me what had happened. On the drive up, she looked out her window and saw a tall, dark figure, exactly like what I had seen 11 months ago, but this time, it was just standing there, staring. As soon as she made eye contact with it, her car radio turned to static. She pretty quickly turned it off and hauled ass to meet up with me. I cannot stress enough how little she believes in the supernatural, so seeing her as freaked out as she was definitely left me a little uneasy. I helped calm her down, and then hopped out of the car to take a piss. I know, literally the stupidest move ever, but at the time, I hadn't remembered what had happened to me previously, and I really had to pee. While I was out there, I definitely felt like something was watching me, but I'm a generally anxious person, so I brushed it off, as I was only going to be out there for like 30 seconds. When I stood up and went back to my door, my girlfriend looked absolutely terrified, and she was staring over my shoulder, not at me. My first thought wasn't anything supernatural. We're both girls, so I assumed that some creepy rapist had crawled out of the grass and was standing right behind me, waiting to hurt us. When I tell you I flew into the driver's seat, I really mean it. My flight reflex took 100% over. I slammed the door, looked over at her, and yelled, "What?" As far as I could tell, there wasn't anyone there. She told me that she had heard faint, female voices coming from the grass, exactly like ours. We were in an open plain, so there was no way that it was an echo. Whatever was out there was mimicking us. The mimicry is what did it for me, and I knew that we had to leave ASAP, especially as I had deciphered my hazy memories of the last time that I saw whatever it was. I didn't tell my girlfriend exactly what was wrong, just turned around so that my headlights were on her car so that she could get out there quickly. Once we were safely away, I called her and told her my thoughts. We're both incredibly spooked right now, obviously. This happened earlier last week at my sister's house. She lives about 5 minutes from me and has a 1-year-old baby girl who, when she goes to sleep, has a baby monitor in her room to make sure that everything is okay. Anyway, my sister had just finished putting my niece to sleep and I was watching her on the baby monitor. Nothing crazy, and it was during the middle of the week around 7:30 p.m. Well, my sister comes downstairs and we make some small talk while I'm on my phone. Then I randomly decide to check the baby monitor, where there is a clear view of a rocking chair in place about 3 feet away from the crib. I saw myself sitting there, wearing a t-shirt and shorts, looking down at my phone in the rocking chair. I was absolutely horrified, and I screamed to my sister about it, and it scared the crap out of her. I had never seen anything like it in my life, and I didn't know how to react. When I looked up and she came rushing over to check the monitor, I was gone. Nothing. Just my niece sleeping in her crib in the dark. The rocking chair, totally empty. Obviously, we had to go and check on her, and I was terrified, and my sister had a bat, but no one was there but her. Nothing was out of place. I wasn't wearing what I had on that night, though. I was clearly wearing a white t-shirt and gym shorts with Nikes on. I had my glasses on, and you could see the bright cell phone screen in the dark as I hunched over to look at it. I never looked at the camera, but could tell that it was me, and I have not been able to sleep much since then. I can't get that picture out of my head, and the baby monitor doesn't record video, or else I would have gone back and looked. It's probably the craziest thing to ever happen to me in my life. I was not high, or drunk, or anything like that. It was a normal weekday after work. Last year, I was living in a small mountain town in central southern Colorado in the Rio Grande National Forest. Super small town. Ute natives were tragically killed in the whole area. I don't usually get creepy vibes when I'm there, but it's definitely weird in many ways. I was in my car at 2 a.m. with a friend. We were parked outside our house looking down the road with the only streetlight across the street lighting up the area. From 15 yards in front of us, we see a large animal emerge from darkness and catch the light. We started asking each other what it was, commenting on its size. It was like the size of a small horse or a big deer. It walked toward us. It stood 1 yard away from my door. We were frozen. We were unable to move, and we just stared at it with it so close to us, and I said, "Is that a wolf?" It's all I could think that it could be. It was tall, completely silver. It looked like a wolf from a movie. As it stood there, it looked up to the sky, and then left, and then to the right. Then it ran away toward the large cliffs at the back of the town where the abandoned mines are, and a large forest begins. We were stunned. We stayed frozen and silent for minutes until we just started laughing. We eventually calmed down and went inside, but were confused as hell. After that, I told some coworkers, thinking how cool it was, that I saw a wolf. They all said that it was impossible, that no wolves had lived there for decades. So I do some research, and they're right. No wolves have been here for like 40 years, and it would be a miracle if I had seen one, especially a gray wolf. As I look at more pictures of wolves, my memory becomes clearer. What I saw was too tall and silver to even be a gray wolf. My friend and I have not forgotten one detail of this story. I'm sure it wasn't a dog. If it was, then that was the biggest dog in existence. I remember the world washing away as I stared at its shining fur. It was possibly the most majestic animal I have ever seen. There were chills covering my body, and I could barely breathe. Do you think that I saw a skinwalker? This just happened today, and it still got me freaked out. I was sitting watching TV when movement in the kitchen caught my eye, and I looked up to see my husband, who'd been taking a nap in the bedroom, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching me. He was wearing his MASH PJs. I looked at him and said, "You okay?" He didn't answer me, and just kept staring. I turned to put the remote on mute and pause, so I could see if he was okay since he just stood there silently staring at me. It took me about 2 seconds to do that, but when I looked up, my husband was gone. The kitchen was silent. So I got up and went into the bathroom thinking he went in there. The bathroom was dark and empty, so I turned into our bedroom to see if he was in there getting dressed. I about crapped my pants when I saw him still laying across the bed, sound asleep, in his jeans and Realtree t-shirt. It dawned on me then that who I saw in the kitchen hadn't been my husband, even though it looked like him, and was wearing PJs that my husband actually owns, but wasn't currently wearing at that time. I can't figure out what happened, or why or how I saw what I did. If you guys can figure it out, or have a good guess, please let me know, because I'm still unnerved. It was creepy. Say their name, and it will kill them. We live in an isolated community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and uncle were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone were moving things around the house. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a large figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncle were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out their rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and began to walk toward them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong that it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off in the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. This thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the dark figure began sprinting. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncle and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman, but not only that. Whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling out about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared, and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather had yelled about had passed away. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, say their name, and it will kill them. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still in disbelief. Little background, I work second shift and get off late at night, where cops are on the hunt for drunk drivers. Quite literally, like the title says, I was driving home from work when I pulled up to a red light. With me at the light was a police officer. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on the cop, never taking my eyes off of them. With me at the light was a police officer. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but after the light turned and they sped off, I maintained a decent tail on them, never taking my eyes off the car. I cannot stress the fact that that isn't an over-exaggeration, because I for sure did not stop looking at the cop car. Eventually I caught up to the car and boom, it was just a normal car. I never saw another car join us on the road. Nobody passed me, and nobody left the road. The cop car didn't turn off, and I didn't lose sight of the car. I obviously wasn't under the influence of anything save caffeine, which I'm accustomed to. It's honestly freaking me out, still. I live in-house of an animal shelter as I'm the on-site vet and do most of the dog's medical needs. We're a non-profit organization, so the majority of our money comes from adoptions, but we are also located out in the middle of the desert with about 20 acres, give or take a couple of acres. I started working here last month, and I have had so many strange occurrences during my nighttime walkthroughs. Living on site means that I room and board here, and typically you get rats and squirrels, small vermin who will poop and agitate the animals. But last night, I was walking around with my flashlight, and one of the dogs who is very calm and chill, his name is Gizmo. He sort of protects me as I've had a raccoon attack last week and had to get a couple shots and some stitching. He comes with me for protection as he's a guard dog of sorts. He's a pit bull terrier. I was counting our dogs and double-checking everyone had gotten their meds, and the cages were locked. I got to the back where trucks can pull in and go out onto the open lot and see what I assumed was a very large dog. I thought that it was one of our big dogs that got out of his pen, so I approached it, but Gizmo started growling and whimpering and pulling back. I flashed my light, and the dog was hunched over still. I pulled Gizmo and he wouldn't budge. I walk over to the kennel where I thought the dog had escaped, but the fuzzball was in his pen. I flash the light in the direction of the dog again, thinking that it's a stray, and see it standing on its hind legs. I don't think anything of it, but that it's a big dog, and that it'll tear Gizmo to pieces, so I release him from my waist leash, and he takes off back to the gate, and sits there whimpering and barking still. I turn to look back at the dog or thing, and keep my light shining, and get my phone out and have 911 ready to dial. That thing stood tall on its two hind legs, and honestly, I was probably stupid to go closer. I got closer, but it started running away on its two hind legs, and it just sent chills down my spine. Gizmo came back to me, and started pulling me away. As I closed and locked the fence, I felt like it was out there again, and so I walked back quick to my room and let Gizmo sleep with me. My boss told me it's my mind playing tricks, but I didn't tell her Gizmo saw and felt the presence as well. About 30 seconds ago, I was sitting on the couch as my dog walked by to go sit on our bed we have behind the L part of the section. She had something small caught in her throat last night, I think a popcorn shell, so I was paying attention to her breathing just to make sure that she got it out. For a few minutes, she was breathing fine, and then what sounded like a light snore started happening. This is semi-normal for her depending on what position she's laying in, so I didn't bother to go over and check. That went on for about 5 minutes, until the most disgusting, and to my now realization terrifying, snore, cough, wheezing sound started happening. I go over to her to make sure she's okay, and the exact moment I looked at her bed, the sound stopped, mid-breath, and she wasn't there. She was outside with my parents. Had been for around 30 minutes. There's no way to get out of the room without walking right past me. I don't know whose fucking dog I saw, or what was making that creepy-ass sound 5 feet away from me. But I'm going to be staying outside for the rest of the day, and hiring an exorcist. This happened a couple years ago on a friend's property. His property line comes up to a heavily wooded area where strange stuff is heard at night. We were hanging out in a small shed out back. I had just introduced one of my childhood friends to this guy, and we were hanging out when we hear his pit bulls going crazy, barking and growling at the woods. Then, an extremely loud, high-pitched shrieking comes from the woods, which made my childhood friend jump. As soon as the shriek was heard, his pit bulls came running in, one of them hiding under my chair. A minute or two later, we see 3 sets of very large, opalescent eyes staring into the shed. We started hearing small, light shrieks as they moved closer to us. I could just barely make out a completely white, gray, bony form before my buddy tells us to cover our ears. As soon as I cover my ears, he pulls out an old revolver and fires 3 shots out the open door, chasing these things off. I looked over at my childhood friend, who just looks like he had a heart attack. My buddy puts the gun on the small table and tells me to take him home, which I gladly did. I've been back over there a few times, and every now and then I hear a shriek coming from the woods, accompanied by my buddy pulling back the hammer of his gun. Last week, at the end of a long shift at a historic hotel, I saw a glimpse of a petite woman with a blonde bob and long beige coat staring up at a wall. It resembled a former manager who had worked there pre-COVID shutdown, but after a second I remembered that she wasn't back to work yet. When I realized this and looked back to where she was, no one was there. My coworker and I quickly scoured the area, but it was vacant. I wrote it off as a benign spirit, as I've experienced some friendly activity there over the years. She just seemed curious or lost. However, I was talking with this former manager on the phone a couple days later, and she told me that she'd just had a dream that she was back working at the hotel and described exactly where she was in the dream. It was the precise location where I had seen the figure. Now, I'm not sure what I believe. Back in 2018, I decided to move out to another state. My friend's mom said that she had seen me a few times on our street at 4 a.m. while she was driving to work. I came back in 2019 and stayed for a couple of weeks and then left to a different state. A couple of nights after I had left, my friend says that she was getting out of her friend's car to head to the front door when she sees me heading to the front door with my 2 red suitcases and the guitar case that I had. She said that once she got out, I turned around and went across the street, going in front of the headlights, where she got a good look at me. I was wearing the same clothes that I had left in, had the same suitcases, and the same guitar case. They say it's a skinwalker, which would make sense because the entire area we live in were Indian burial sites. The area has always been supercharged with energy, but from my understanding, skinwalkers imitate animals? I'm not sure what it was. Definitely wasn't a ghost, because I'm still alive. But now I'm back here with my friend at the same house, and I would really like to know what could be impersonating me. I work in procurement for a large corporation. I meet with a lot of salespeople. In the industry in my area, people move around to different companies a lot. A familiar person came in. I had done a significant amount of business with him at the onset of my career 10 years ago. I said, "Hi, Steve. It's been a while. When did you leave Acme?" He looked confused and said, "I never worked for them." I let it die, and everyone chalked it up as mistaken identity. The problem is that I immediately recognized him. We had spent a lot of time together on a project. His voice and mannerisms were very familiar. I was kind of spooked. Later, I tried to locate my former associate, and I cannot.